Hello, class. Welcome back. Here we are in April. It's April 2nd. This is our lecture, the only lecture for the April 2nd date on our calendar, with the exciting title, The Colonies Mature. I'm going to warn you right now, this one is sort of a hodgepodge. My goal here is to try to bring together 75, maybe 100 years worth of colonial history. We've established the beginning of the early English colonies with the previous two lectures. The Chesapeake colonies, Jamestown became Virginia, Maryland's, and then the New England colonies, all those Puritans who argued with each other in the last lecture. So our job here is going to be to carry the story forward. By the time we're done with this lecture, we're going to have basically the entire colonial system in place. We're going to be talking about some of the things that are going on in England and their ripple effect and impact over here in the colonies, and then finish the story roughly 1740 or so, somewhere in that era. We can slow things down a little bit for the next class. You'll notice that the reading has picked up considerably. That a lot has to do with the fact that for tonight I am doing an awful lot of material all at once and trying to hit on some of the high points, whereas the textbook is going to have more details for some of this information. Okay, so the first thing that I need to do is to catch you up on some of the things that have been going on in England. So when last we heard things were going on in England, Charles I was the king, having all those problems that he was having with Parliament and with the Puritans, which ultimately led to the English Civil War, which broke out in the 1640s. And when all was said and done, it didn't work out all that well for Charles I. Parliament and their forces defeated the king and his forces. In 1651, he got his head cut off, and the war was over. Parliament had achieved a massive victory against this king who really thought that he was the cat's meow and that he could pretty much run the show. After that, though, there was a strange period in English history because without that king, the real question was who was going to run the country. They hadn't had a non-monarch in the past, and so after some confusion, ultimately the leaders of Parliament decided that they did need to have some sort of central figure, even though they, as Parliament, would really still be running the country. And so they installed a key military leader, one of the guys who had helped Parliament's forces defeat the king's forces during the Civil War. His name is Oliver Cromwell. He's not a king. Specifically, his title is he's the Lord Protector of England, and is the key guy, the leader in the 1650s, and ruled as the Lord Protector, not as a monarch, not reigning over the country, given these powers delegated to him by Parliament, but ruled for about half a decade in the 1650s. Cromwell's theory was that if the country was so divided in the years after the English Civil War, the best way to unify is against an outside enemy. And so Irish people, anyone with an Irish background knows that Oliver Cromwell is, to them, is just about as big of a jerk as they can ever imagine, because Cromwell, during his period as Lord Protector, did some pretty nasty things in Ireland, and the Irish people think of him still as quite a villain. So Cromwell was pretty successful as the Lord Protector, and certainly the people who had supported Parliament against the king, and especially all the Puritans who had hated that previous king, they thought that he was a pretty good guy because he was on their side. But they hadn't really made plans for what was going to happen after Cromwell. He died in 1658, and after, again, some confusion, the leaders of Parliament decided to put his son, Richard Cromwell, as the new Lord Protector. Unfortunately, Richard Cromwell didn't have the same political savvy as his father did, and didn't have the tremendous war record that his father did, and just didn't really have the same kind of success. And so the leaders of Parliament, who had put the Cromwells, one and then the other, in this position as Lord Protector, began to feel stirrings of concern because it seemed as if the English population was not really satisfied with the direction of the country. And ultimately, after much debate, the leaders of Parliament decided that they were going to reach out to, of course, not to Charles I, because he's dead, but instead to his son, who had fled the country and gone to France in exile. And so the leaders of Parliament in 1660 engage in a delicate negotiation with the son of the previous king to discuss with him the possibility of him returning to the throne as the monarch, as a new king, but with certain expectations about agreeing to limits on his authority. really the son of the previous king has limited bargaining power. If he didn't accept the limits, then he's not going to get the job. And ultimately, he accepted that if restored to the throne, that he would not try to do the same kinds of things, not usurp power the same way his father had done. And so in 1660, there's a moment in English history that's called the Restoration. They had a monarch, they got rid of the monarch, and now they've restored the monarchy. There's a king again, and from that point till now, there will be kings and sometimes queens who will rule the country. There's more to say about what that's going to mean in terms of who's really in charge, but we're getting to that. At this moment, this is a big deal in English history. It's called the Restoration. They make a big deal of this. It's 1660. The son of the previous Charles became the new king, and he is Charles II. And if the current prince ever becomes king, which who knows, then he would be Charles III, in case you're wondering. So Charles II regained the throne in 1660, and he had a lot of favors to pay back. And he also wanted to refocus the attention of the English government on their empire, which really for the last few decades they had languished because they had so many internal problems. So, for the purposes of the colonies, the restoration turns things around. Previously, for most of the 1600s, the English government had pretty much left them alone, let the Chesapeake colonies do their thing, let the New England colonies do their thing. Economically was hoping for some support and so forth, but really mostly led them to their own devices. But after the restoration of the monarchy and after Charles II became the new king, then from that point on, the English government is going to be paying a lot more attention to their colonial holdings here in North America. And this will have a number of repercussions for who and what's going on here in the colonies. First of all, the new king, King Charles II, has a lot of favors to pay back because, of course, there were key leaders in Parliament who he really needs to thank, and he needs the support of some important people in the country if he's going to continue to be king. So, in the period after the Restoration, there was a new wave of colony making. And there's a bunch of new colonies that were carved out of the eastern seaboard that eventually will become modern day states of the United States. A series of colonies were created that, as a group, are referred to as the Restoration colonies. And effectively, what Charles is going to do is try to fill in the map. There is the Chesapeake colonies that already existed. There are New England colonies farther to the north. His goal here is to make sure he has an extended chain of colonies that are interconnected, and then to expand that where opportunities existed. Again, he can't get too close to the Spanish because Spanish have Florida and the areas around that, and he can't get too far into the interior because the French are there, and also because there's mountains and other things that are obstacles to that kind of expansion. But along the coastline of the Atlantic coast of North America, Charles did begin the process of filling in new colonies after the Restoration. So the first of these is going to be farther to the south than Virginia. Still Chesapeake, and then a little bit farther is the colony that's established in 1663 and called Carolina. Eventually, in 1720, Carolina would be divided into two colonies. There's a North Carolina and a South Carolina for reasons that you guys don't really need to worry about. Carolina probably never occurred to you to wonder why it's called what it is, but it is from the Latin for Charles. So naming a colony Carolina is, as is the case when we had Jamestown previously, is an example of naming something after the monarch back in England, a colony that he never set foot in and knew really only a little bit about. The Carolina colony was similar to the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland, which had been in existence now for a generation or two. Um, it is a coastal colony. It is agricultural based. They have plantations. Tobacco is going to be something that will be grown in the Carolinas, but not nearly as much as was the case in the other parts of the Chesapeake colonies, because there are other crops that it turned out were even more effective and more revenue producing in the Carolinas. So the two crops, the two revenue crops that the Carolinas grew were rice and indigo. Indigo is a dye that's used for dyeing clothes, and in those days, those early modern days, having any kind of change or variety in the color of clothing is something that's going to be quite valuable. So both of those thrived in the climate and soil conditions, especially along the coastline. If you've been down to the Outer Banks of the Carolinas, you know that it's, of course, very humid, very moist, um, and there's a lot of water available. And all that is good for growing rice, which is, of course, a staple crop throughout the world, and then this indigo crop, which is also productive and useful and valuable. So the Carolinas, because of when they're established and because they went quickly to having different kinds of plantation agriculture, wound up looking economically a lot like the other Chesapeake colonies. Although they don't grow as much tobacco, they grow some. Still, they had learned some lessons about the economics of how that was going to work, especially for the labor force. And the fact that the Carolinas were established later in the 1600s meant that they largely skipped over that transitional phase where there were indentured servants who did a lot of the growing, especially as we heard around Jamestown. That didn't happen very much in the Carolinas. Instead, once the Carolinas began to be significantly established and it was clear that they were going to be plantation-based agriculture as their main economics, at that point, the Carolinians, their labor force was going to be almost completely slaves. Part of this also has to do with the fact that many of the early Carolinian settlers were from Barbados, which is an island in the Caribbean. There were sugar plantations there that had been long established for decades, and the kind of labor force used in Barbados and other parts of the Caribbean colonies, where there are other similar sugar plantations, was slavery based, African slavery based, and was incredibly intense and horrible. The treatment of the slaves in the Caribbean is incredibly intense and terrible, worse even than the kind of slavery that typically we'll hear about later when we get to the United States and cotton. Anywhere where there's sugar plantations, it leads to incredible, intense labor, violence in the labor force, and some very tragic results, even more than usual, for the terrible tragedy of slavery. So these Barbadian settlers brought with them some preconceived notions about the treatment of slaves, part of which is due to the fact that both in the Barbadian areas and the other Caribbean places where there are sugar plantations and in the Carolinas, the white people were very much outnumbered by the slave labor force. By the time South Carolina split away from North Carolina in 1720, about two-thirds of all the human beings in South Carolina were black slaves. Among other things, that gives you an idea of just the intensity of the labor required in in the rice and indigo plantations of the Carolinas. But it also gives you some idea of the kind of the efforts that the South Carolinian plantation owners had to use to manage their slaves because they're so outnumbered. They're fearful at all times that terrible things are going to happen. The lesson that they learned from the early settlers that they had learned from the barbaric slavery in the Caribbean is to use force and incredible amounts of force. The threat of violence is inherent in slavery, but it's something that is unquestionably used throughout the Carolinas, especially in South Carolina. South Carolina is dominated by Charleston, which will be the main port for decades that African slaves are going to come in through, and before they get distributed to the other parts, especially of the plantation South. Um, Many fortunes are made in slavery as a result, in especially South Carolina, but also an incredibly intense and really barbaric treatment of the slaves as a result of the kind of slavery that they believe that they're used to. For a long time, we'll see the Carolinas and especially South Carolina will be the biggest defender of a certain kind of slavery, really of all slavery, um, dating back to their early foundings here in the 1660s. Okay, so that's one part of the map. Much, much later, farther south in the Carolinas, in the 1740s, there will be another colony that will be thrown in there. Not one of the restoration colonies, but I'll mention it now. Georgia was basically attached at the bottom there, 1730s and into 1740s, partly as a plantation colony, partly to expand the colonial map, and partly as a place for England to put some of its prisoners. Um, they emptied the jails and basically sent those people over to Georgia as early founders as the labor force of that colony. But that comes much later. Mostly Carolina is the dominant and eventually the two Carolinas, the dominant part of that southern part of the Chesapeake. All right, moving up the coast, there's a gap in between the New England colonies, those Puritan colonies where they'd all been fighting amongst themselves in the last lecture, and these Chesapeake colonies, the southern colonies, which are all plantation based. That middle area there had, of course, been the Dutch colonies, um, the New Amsterdam colony that had existed since the 1620s. But the Dutch colony had fallen on hard times. They're having economic problems, and they're never really very successful anyway, and not very heavily populated, especially compared to some of these English colonies that are growing up around them. So, as part of this post restoration effort to hone in and pay more attention to North America, the English under Charles II in 1664 basically invaded and took over the New Netherlands colony. Um, Although the Dutch settlers weren't that thrilled to have the English take over, there was very little fighting. It was clear that they really couldn't win. And when the English took over, they imposed very, very easy restrictions on their lives. The Dutch settlers were allowed to keep the Dutch language. They're allowed to keep the Dutch Reformed churches that most of them worshipped in. And many of the same people were the elites in this new colony that was managed from England. It's not New Netherlands anymore. Instead, it was divided up into two things. North of the harbor, so basically Long Island, Manhattan, and then north of that, that was given to the king's brother, the Duke of York, and therefore referred to as New York. South of the harbor, so south of New York City, basically, but east of the Delaware River, that thing that sort of looks like, I don't know, a keg with something sticking out of the bottom or whatever, that small colony was given to a couple of investors who called it New Jersey, named after there's a little island off the coast of England, the Isle of Jersey. And these people had roots there, so they named it after them. For a time in the early 1700s, New Jersey was actually divided up, and there was an East Jersey and a West Jersey, which is very peculiar. I grew up in New Jersey, and I can tell you that New Jersey, if you're ever dividing it, you don't divide it that way. You would divide North Jersey and South Jersey. In South Jersey, they root for the Eagles. In North Jersey, they root for the Giants. North Jersey, they watch New York TV, and in South Jersey, they watch Philadelphia TV. South Jersey, they eat cheesesteaks. North Jersey, they eat pizza. That makes more sense. East Jersey, West Jersey, that's absurd. And so, fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. So, New York and New Jersey were the colonies that were carved out of these former Dutch settlements where the Dutch people continued to live, but eventually, over the decades that followed, are going to be outnumbered as more and more English people move into those areas. And then the last of the restoration colonies happens a little bit later. This one is going to be in 1681. And in fact, at this point, we're pretty late in Charles's reign. At this point, he is approached by the leader, an important figure in England, a guy named William Penn. Penn was in a non-Anglican Protestant faith called the Quakers. Officially, they're called the Society of Friends. The Quakers had been established a few decades earlier as a splinter group, a new form of the Protestant faith in the 1630s and 40s. Officially, they're called the Society of Friends because the founders, people like George Fox, they emphasized this Christian belief in the soul and the Holy Spirit being something that all humans have that makes them different from, wild animals or trees or whatever. Because everyone, according to this Christian interpretation of the soul, because everyone has that spark of divinity within them, the Society of Friends emphasized equality and a leveling of any kind of stratification in society. They objected to a lot of the way the Anglican Church worked, and they tried to establish separate denominations, which you'll recall was illegal. And many of the early leaders of the Society of Friends were thrown into jail, were arrested on multiple occasions, either for disturbing the peace or for heresy, for opposing the main Church of England. And that's how they got their name. One of the early founders of the church was put on trial, And during the trial, it was clear that the whole deck is stacked against him. Everyone who is there, they think that all the things that he's saying are ridiculous. They're making fun of him. They're mocking him. Even the judge, who's supposed to be impartial, the judge is basically laughing at this guy for some of the ridiculous things that he is saying, like that all people are equal because they all have the same soul, the same spark of divinity. It's absurd, of course. How could anyone possibly believe such a thing? So at a certain moment in the trial, when the Society of Friends leader was being mocked roundly, he turned to the judge and he said, Your Honor, you shouldn't be laughing at me. You should be quaking because I, unlike you, know what the true religion is going to be, and God is on my side, not on yours, and therefore you should be, should be concerned. You should be worried. They all thought that was hilarious. The idea that these people who are about to throw him in jail, they're the ones who should be quaking in fear. And so as a result, quaking or Quakers is something that got part of the nickname for this group and eventually became a name that more or less they adopted, not as the official name, but as the most common name. And so the Quakers are a fairly small group of independent Protestants in England at a time when that's dangerous to be, because officially you have to be an Anglican in England, and if you're not, then you're in danger. It's fine to be rich and to be something different. And so the Penn family, William Penn and his family, they're all Quakers and they're fine. They're not going to get thrown in jail. You can get away with stuff like that if you're rich. But there are plenty of other Quakers who were in more danger. And so William Penn approached the king in the very early 1680s and offered to set up a new colony with his family running it on the other side of the Delaware River, so going west across the Delaware away from New Jersey, that he and his family would run it and manage it, but it would be a colony that would be part of the English Empire, that the king would get support from, and William Penn proposed that it would be a place, a haven for Quakers, similar to the way a couple generations earlier, Maryland had been established as a haven for Catholics. And like his father, or grandfather, I guess, like his ancestor, Charles II saw some logic in this because not only is he going to get to add a feather to his cap and add another colony, but also it's a place where he can essentially get rid of some of the troublemakers in the country. So William Penn didn't himself go to the colony that he named after himself, Pennsylvania, which basically means a place for the Penns. Instead, however, some of his family members did, and this is unusual. Most of these other colonies were established in absentia. If there's a company in England who is sponsoring a colony, they almost never go themselves. They just send people to do it for them. But the Penn family did. So William's son and some other members of his family were some of the early leaders of this colony. They went to the other side of the Delaware River. Back in the day, there had been the New Sweden colony on both sides of that part of the Delaware, so they had some background information that they can build out of, and recognized that this place would be a good place. It has a good harbor. The Delaware gives them access ultimately to the Atlantic and thus sea access to the rest of the world. And it looked like the climate and other conditions would be good as they expanded west away from the river. So their first settlement in the colony of Pennsylvania is the town, and then city of Philadelphia. Philadelphia, if you watch sports, and there are no sports on TV anymore, but someday there will be again. And if you're from around here and you're watching a game that takes place in Philadelphia, it's probably always seemed weird to you when the announcers say, "Welcome to the city of brotherly love." Because, Eagles fans have a bad reputation, and Phillies fans have a bad reputation, and Flyers fans have a terrible reputation. They booed Santa Claus, and they used to throw, rocks and all kinds of other things at opposing teams. But actually, that's the name of the city. Philadelphia is Latin for City of Brotherly Love. And that makes sense if you remember who founded this colony. That town and the colony that it's going to be the biggest place in is established by the Quakers, who are the Society of Friends, who believe in equality, who believe in brotherly love, who are emphasizing a different form of religion, one without hierarchy, without as much structure, Quaker meetings are not like most Christian services. They are much less hierarchical, much less structured. There's a lot less pre-planning that goes into some of the meetings because pretty much everyone can speak up as the Spirit moves them, as the phrase goes. And of course, there are Quaker churches in our area, and there are of course Quaker schools, including Sandy Springs School or the Sidwell Friends School. Which are based out of the Quaker religion. So, of course, there's some Quakers moved to this area later as well. Now, the Pennsylvania colony, established by the Penn family as a Quaker haven in 1681, rapidly expanded. As they moved to the west and as they took Native American land farther to the west, as of course all these other colony makers are doing as well, they discovered that they had hit an area that was very lush. It was very easy to grow food in. And eventually, the Pennsylvania colony became very successful. Ultimately, by the middle 1700s, Philadelphia will be the biggest city in the colonies, in part because there's so much food from farther out in Pennsylvania that's coming through their port, and also as an important city in the middle of all these colonies. Um, they're sort of in a good location, an advantageous location to sort of connect everybody else together. Um, so these colonies that were created in the aftermath of the Restoration, in some ways they don't have a lot to do with each other. You know, the Carolinas, with their very intense slave-based growing of some tobacco, mostly rice and indigo, on these big plantations for the wealth of a handful of people, seem in many ways very different from what's going on in Pennsylvania, where there's a little bit of slavery, but not very much, where they're not growing anything like rice or tobacco or indigo, although they grow things, and very different from what's going on across the Delaware River in New Jersey or up in New York. Um, and yet, there are some important connections that you can make. Ultimately, as you look at the map of the colonies, you can really, after Pennsylvania is established anyway, certainly by the turn of the 1700s, you can look at these colonies not as one big unit. They are, of course, all controlled by the English back overseas, but you can think of them as sort of three different strands or three sections. The New England colonies, which are essentially the Puritan colonies that we established last class, and then the ones that expanded out from there, they are based on trade. They are mercantile. There is some agriculture, but it's mostly just for local growing. Um, and they're the ones that started out pretty religious and became eventually those very competitive Yankees, the traders who always get the best part of the deal. Farther to the south, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, those are going to be the plantation based colonies, mostly focused on slavery, especially after 1676 and Bacon's Rebellion, and everything that that means. Full on slave societies. There was slavery in the other parts of the colonies, but the southern colonies with their plantations are going to be the slave colonies, the slave South. But the middle colonies, which are most of the ones that were created in the Restoration, they're a little bit of both. They have their own identity. Um, Although you can grow some large scale agriculture in some parts of the middle colonies, the climate and soil really isn't ripe for the kinds of cash crops that dominated the southern colonies. So you're not going to have tobacco or rice or indigo or the cotton that will come later. That's really not something that's an option in New Jersey or in New York or in Pennsylvania. Not an option. But they also are not as cold and sort of stark as the New England colonies, where scraping out a living as a farmer is very difficult. Instead, most of New York, most of New Jersey, and most of Pennsylvania, these colonies are really, really well set up to grow staple foods, to grow crops like wheat and other grains that then are going to be the key staple foods for everybody to eat. And as a result, the middle colonies, as they're known, are basically the breadbasket colonies for the rest of the colonies here and to some extent the rest of the world because it is so easy to grow things that people need to eat that there's going to be a surplus from that region that then will be sold up to the northern colonies where it is difficult to grow as much food, and will be sold to the southern colonies where they could have grown it if they wanted to, but the plantation owners there prefer to use as much space as possible growing things that they can then sell as opposed to growing food for themselves. So as a result, the middle colonies get the reputation as the breadbasket colonies. And they ship wheat and other things also overseas. And as a result, that section, even though it was started later, really grew dramatically, which is part of the reason why Philadelphia did so well and became, by the time of the Revolution, became really the dominant city. New York, Boston, Charleston are going to be sort of close but secondary. Um, so those colonies are part of this restoration moment. Um, and there's another thing that's going on at the same time, which is that if England is going to be trying to make more colonies, they're also going to be trying to control the colonies more. Again, in the early days, whether it was the Puritans setting up their religious-based colonies up in New England, or whether it was the early Chesapeake settlers just barely scratching out a living, and in some cases almost dying in huge numbers, until they finally settled in and were able to figure out that plantation agriculture was going to be their economic savior. Um, Unlike that, um, from this point on, uh, the English leadership is going to be focused on making sure that these colonies are successful, and they want to have more control over them. The English leadership had pretty much stayed away from a lot of day-to-day management of affairs in the early days of creating the colonies in the 15 and 1600s. But now, after the Restoration, King Charles II is going to spend an awful lot of time. He and the people working under him are going to be spending an awful lot of time managing the colonies because they're realizing that they are important to England. Which does raise a question. And the question is, why would anyone have colonies? What even is the point? Setting up a colony anywhere is incredibly expensive. It's something that is requires a lot of luck in the early days. A lot of the early English colonies had failed. The company that set up Jamestown went out of business. The company that gave the Pilgrims the right to establish their colony in Plymouth basically got nothing from the deal. And England, in some ways, seems like they're not really getting much out of it, which then raises the question, what even is the point here? Why would the English even care enough to have these colonies overseas? Sure, the Puritans wanted a place to go and pray the way they wanted, and the Catholics in Maryland likewise, and the Quakers in Pennsylvania, that all makes sense. But why would England and why would the English people and the English leadership care that much about what's going on here in the colonies? And the answer to that question is part of a broader economic theory that really dominated Europe and Europe's relation with the rest of the world for centuries, from the very beginning of especially the Spanish colonies, and is going to be the dominant economic idea for 3 or 4 centuries uh, as the Europeans look at each other and look at their connection to the rest of the world. So there's a theory, an economic theory called mercantilism that is going to explain everything here. Mercantilism is sort of an easy thing and a hard thing. You can impress your friends next time you're talking to them on Zoom or on FaceTime, and they say, "Hey, what'd you learn in class today?" You can say, "Oh, I learned about mercantilism," and your friends will say, "Well, what's that?" And you can say, "Mercantilism is the theory that a country is only as strong as its trade." And they'll be impressed and they'll move on and they won't ask any follow-up questions because who in their right minds would. Unfortunately, that's not enough for us. So it's good for us to know that that's the basic idea. The idea of mercantilism is a country is only as strong as its trade. But I think you kind of need to know what that means. So let's get the context here. Europe, for centuries, had been a place where people are always fighting. And that was true no matter how far back you go. Basically, to the end of the Roman Empire, the story of European history and politics is about I'm fighting you, you're fighting me, If I'm not fighting you now, I'm going to fight you next year or 10 years from now, or maybe you're fighting someone else and then I'm going to go help them or whatever. Europe was a place of incredible instability and a lot of violence. And there are so many different countries in Europe that inevitably, when maybe one country fights against another country, they will look for allies, and those sets of allies would change from one year to the next, from one decade to the next, from one war to the next. So in one given fight, you might have Spain and France fighting against the Holy Roman Empire or something like that. You might have parts of Italy and France fighting against Portugal. You never know from one war or one moment of instability to the next how those alliances are going to match up. Which means that from this war to the next war, my friends now might be my enemies the next time, and so forth. And a lot of, especially for the weaker countries, a lot of what they needed to do is be careful about who they got dragged into a war against or who they got dragged into a war supporting. Uh, because you can't really know for sure permanently who your allies are, these countries felt very unstable and uncertain about their fate. Because all you need to do is pick one bad alliance or get dragged into one bad war, and it can have catastrophic results, of course, because losing a war is never good. But also, picking the wrong alliance can be very bad. And so, politically, geopolitically, the Europeans in this period tried to emphasize self sufficiency. They don't want to get dragged into wars that they don't want to be involved in. They want to be able to make their own decisions. They don't want to have some other country kind of forcing them to, hey, help me out against my enemies because, you need me. And that's where the economics part of this comes in. Because European countries not only need to worry about being militarily independent, being able to make their own geopolitical decisions, they also need to make sure that economically they're independent. So, the idea of mercantilism, based on this instability, is that countries should have policies that will allow them economically to rely only on themselves. The goal of mercantilism is to not have to buy all of your goods from another country. If you get all your stuff from another country and then that country goes to war against you, then you're hosed. If you get all your stuff from another country and that country goes to war with another country, then they're going to force you to help them out, whether you want to or not, whether it looks like they're going to win or not. The goal of mercantilism is to make sure that doesn't happen, to make sure that economically your country is completely self sufficient, that you don't rely for anything important on any other country. Instead, the main economic goal of mercantilism is to have what's called a trade surplus, to sell more than you buy. Because if you sell stuff to another country and you don't buy as much from that country, not only are you going to hold on to more money as a result, and the kings and queens love that because then that's money that's going to get stored away in the royal treasury to be used for whatever they need to use it for in the future. But also, if you're selling more to another country than you're buying from them, if there's ever a crisis, then you can't be forced by the economics to help them out. Instead, you might be able to force them to help you out. Because if they need you more than them, then you have more leverage. This is especially true in key goods, so food, obviously, but other important products. You want to have a trade surplus to whatever extent possible, because then that gives you the kind of leverage necessary, the kind of flexibility necessary to not get dragged into wars that it is clear are bad for the success of the country. So, you want to have a trade surplus, especially in key things. You want to hold on to as much gold or precious metals as possible, because that's something you can use for whatever you need when the next war comes or when supplies are cut off to some other country you do business with. You want to have a fleet. Today it would be airplanes or trucks or things like that. In those days, the goal is to have a merchant fleet, to have as many ships as possible. Because if you sell more than you buy, but you're doing it all in somebody else's ships and they still really control the situation and they can just cut off access to the ships. So you want to have as many of your own ships as possible. And the key thing here is that the math doesn't really work out. If every country in Europe is trying to have a trade surplus, then some countries are going to fail, and that's going to lead to this kind of instability that will eventually lead to wars and the problems that Europeans are scared of. But that's only if they focus on Europe. The world is bigger than this now. Ever since Columbus, ever since the Spanish started to have successes with their Spanish colonies, it became clear to a lot of the major European powers and the rising powers like England that the way you can make mercantilism work is by having a colony. A colonial network provides you, the mother country, the home country as it's called, with an opportunity, a chance to make mercantilism work. Because the job of a colony, under the mercantilism philosophy, the job of a colony is to support the mother country, to support the home country. The colony must buy all of their goods from the mother country, which will expand the economy of the mother country. The colony, their job is not to create themselves as an independent economy and to be as successful as possible. Their job is to produce things that the mother country needs or produce things that the mother country can then sell to other Europeans. So, in this economic philosophy, the job of the colonies is purely supportive and helping the mother country, the major nations of Europe, be as economically independent as possible. But it also means that the European countries who manage these colonies are not thinking about someday the colonies becoming strong and powerful. They see them purely as subordinate, and in fact, they need to make sure that they stay that way. That's an important long-term idea. Colonies could never get strong enough or independent enough that they would ever really manage themselves on their own, because then they might make different decisions. The job of the colonies is purely to support the mother country. The job of the English colonies, from this point of view, is purely to support England, support its economy, support its economic independence, to support it militarily. That's the job of the colonies. And to think of anything else is inconceivable. So, after the restoration of the monarchy, after the English begin to take their colonies a little bit more seriously, as they begin to sort of see themselves now more as a European power and thinking about how they set up vis-a-vis France and Spain and the other major European countries, as they start to take colonies more seriously, the English after the Restoration will take mercantilism more seriously, because they can't have these colonies just sort of being scratched out for and just getting started and then making their own decisions, because then eventually the colonies might do business with their enemies, or the colonies might eventually become independent and not become that interested in supporting the mother country. That can't happen. Mercantilism requires the colonies to be subordinate and to work 100% of the time in supporting the mother country, in this case England. So, right after the restoration of the monarchy, just as Charles II is getting back into this colony game, getting back into thinking about his colonial empire and how England can become strong again, at that point, England began to implement mercantilism as a policy in a way that it had not really previously. So, starting in 1660, right as the restoration is underway, and continuing for a series of years afterwards, a bunch of laws were passed in Parliament, which is the lawmaking body, the equivalent of our Congress. A bunch of laws were passed that are called the Navigation Acts. There are several of these. The first one is passed in 1660. That's the only date that I think you need to know. There's no reason to get hung up on the details of the first Navigation Act and the second Navigation Act, because they all effectively are working for the same purpose. The basic idea of the Navigation Acts, the first of which is in 1660, is to require that the colonies here, the English colonies, always economically support England. And the mechanism for that is that all trade that the colonies are engaged in has to go through England. So, what that means is that any trade back and forth between the colonies and England, fine, that's just going to work out the way it always does. If the English are selling, say, tables to the colonies, then that's bunch of tables are going to get put on a ship and sent over to the colonies and sold to the colonists. If the colonists are growing tobacco and they're selling that back to England, no big deal. Put it on an English ship, send it back to England. Fine. But according to the Navigation Acts, if someone in the colonies is doing business with, say, another country in Europe, so suppose some of that tobacco is going to be sold to Spain, according to the Navigation Acts, it has to be put on an English ship, taken to England, and then taken on an English ship to Spain, as opposed to a Spanish ship coming and collecting the tobacco and bringing it directly to Spain, because that's not going to help out the English. Now, that example is something where, Spain's not that far from England. And so, although the Spanish are going to wish that they had easy access to the cheap tobacco, and instead are going to be annoyed that someone in England is going to be raising the price and making some money as a middleman, that economically is something you can imagine. But because the Navigation Acts require every amount of trade that's coming through the colonies to go through England. And so sometimes, a lot of times, this idea seems a little forced. So, for example, if someone in the colonies wants to buy a load of sugar from one of the Spanish sugar colonies in the Caribbean, say Cuba, where there's tons of sugar being grown all the time, um, instead of sending a ship from, say, Boston directly down to Cuba to get a delivery of that sugar. Instead, the way it has to work under the Navigation Acts is that the Spanish have to bring that shipload of sugar over to England, and then it's put in an English ship and then shipped across the North Atlantic all the way to Boston. That is obviously economically inefficient. It's going to be much more expensive, more risk of the ship sinking and so forth, or getting damaged or stuff getting stolen along the way. But that's required under the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts require that English ships are involved and the English are going to get a part of every bit of business that the colonies are doing. They're trying to make sure that the colonies do not rely more on these other countries or these other countries' colonies, and they want to make sure that every economic transaction that the colonists are doing is going to work to the benefit of England and not so much the colonies. The colonies are an afterthought in this. Now, the inefficiencies and the sort of absurdity of some of the requirements of the Navigation Acts were clear to the colonists from the very beginning. Trade is going to be a very, very important part of what these colonists are going to be doing, especially in the big port cities up in New England, Boston, Providence, New Haven, Connecticut. In the Middle Atlantic, you have in the middle colonies, you have New York, you have Philadelphia, the two most important ports in the middle of the country, and eventually two of the biggest cities. And then farther to the south, in the Chesapeake, and farther south, you have ultimately Charleston is really the most important of the southern ports. The merchants who are doing well in those parts of the colonies obviously are irritated by some of the inefficiencies that are happening as a result of the Navigation Acts. The idea that they have to ship everything away from the path that is the most direct path just so it goes through England means that to them, their profits are going to be hurt, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. But they're required to do it by the law. And so the solution that many of the Americans came up with was to ignore the law. You'll be pleased to know that in the 1600s and continuing well into the 1700s, all the way up to the American Revolution, as the English tried to impose the Navigation Acts, the American response was to become some of the biggest lawbreakers in the history of the world. The laws existed, the English were trying to enforce them, and the colonists did their best to ignore them, to get around them, to cheat them, to figure out ways to get around the system, and they got very good at it. Some of the most successful smuggling in the history of the world was done in and out of American ports from the passage of the Navigation Acts in the 1660s all the way up to the eve of the American Revolution as things are going to be working their way toward the 1770s. So, the United States of America, founded, among other things, by a bunch of smugglers, by a bunch of lawbreakers. Congratulations if that gives you a feeling of national pride. Part of the reason why the colonists were successful in their smuggling activities was that the navigation acts and mercantilism as a whole is being managed from England, which is way on the other side of the Atlantic. And although there are representatives of the English government in the port cities up and down the eastern seaboard, the folks who are running this back in England don't really understand what's going on. They have only a very limited sense of what's truly happening here in their English colonies. Some of the shipments did go through England. The English economy did expand in the decades after the Navigation Acts. They're aware of the fact that the colonial economies are doing well, that their economies are expanding, and that they're doing well from their trade as well. But if both are doing well, they don't ask too many questions about it. And ultimately, a lot of this smuggling went on, and people back in England were somewhat unaware. Um, Part of the reason for that is that the mechanism to enforce the Navigation Acts is again run out of England. There was a previously existing government body called the Board of Trade. It had been created in the 1650s, and it ramped up in the 1660s after the Navigation Acts were created. The Board of Trade, based out of London, are a bunch of merchants sort of appointed by the king whose job it is to enforce mercantilism, to make sure the Navigation Acts are happening the way they're supposed to. These people are managing this from England, and they get reports and so forth from what's going on over here in the colonies. But, the colonists are pretty good about cheating. The colonists would make up stuff. The colonists would produce false information or just reports that really didn't actually in any way reflect what was going on. A lot of the trade that they're doing is indeed going directly to the Spanish colonies, directly to the French colonies, directly to Spanish or the French or other Europeans. And they just sort of cheated or lied about it. And the Board of Trade over in England really doesn't know. They have very little idea. They're getting very scanty information. This is, it'd be much harder to get away with today, although smuggling still happens in the world. It'd be a lot harder to get away with today, given the kinds of sophisticated technology that we have now, where information is available, at a finger point. In those days, the Board of Trade is basing their information on sketchy stuff that they may getting months or weeks after a shipment has actually already been paid for, or shipped, or arrived, or whatever. And then the colonists are just sort of lying about it and getting away with it. So the English are trying to have more control over these colonies. They're making this effort. They believe that they were successful. They saw that their economy was doing well. They saw that the colonial economy was doing well. They saw the linkages in the empire seemed to be being enhanced, and they thought that it was working. The reality was it was not. The reality was that the colonists are avoiding it or cheating or lying as much as they can, and then they got away with it for so long that they kind of assumed that was the way it was always going to be. Eventually, that lack of faith and that lack of communication within the imperial system is going to be a problem. But in the short run, and it's not that short of a run, over decades, both sides seem to be doing pretty well. The English Empire is successful. England is growing as a major European power, indeed as a major international power, because of the success of their empire. And over here in the colonies, a lot of fortunes are being made. People are doing well. Overall, the colonial economy is booming. Seem like things are working out. So this effort at more economic control predicated on the idea of mercantilism, it seemed at first like it was working, but it's only working because the colonists are lying about the fact that they're not doing it as much as the English thought, and they're getting away with it. Long term, that's going to be a problem. All right, at the same time, as the English are paying more attention to the colonies, as the English are saying these colonies are something that we need to be having more control over because we want to make sure that we get as much as we can out of them, the English also got more involved in the politics and the local politics of what's going on here, here in the colonies. The king, his advisors in the Board of Trade, people in Parliament, and other people with influence over the colonies are trying to take more of a direct role in making sure that the colonies are running and being organized the way people back in England want them to be. And so they're going to try to have more political control that goes along with this economic control of mercantilism. That's all happening. And a lot of the reading for tonight and continuing into the reading for next week, a lot of it is going to be about many, many specific instances where the English tried to have more control over things here in the colonies and things were difficult to control. The colonists are a bunch of different kinds of people. The same size doesn't fit everybody. From one circumstance to the other, it's not always easy for some outsider to tell the colonists what to do when they don't really understand local conditions. And so there's going to be a low, simmering amount of conflict where political outsiders from England are going to try to tell colonial leaders what to do. And at one time or another, there's a crisis of one sort or another that's going to lead maybe one particular colony or maybe a few colonies to reject or fight back or ignore or in some other way not go through with or try to fight back against these efforts by the English to control the colonies. And that's a long, simmering, small boil conflict. Um, there's stuff that happens in New York. There's stuff that happens in New England. There's stuff that happens from time to time in the Chesapeake. Um, these efforts are really not that successful. And that's really the theme you should be picking up on here. The English are trying to have more control. They're trying to manage these colonies, but they're doing it from far away. And they're doing it from too far away to really kind of understand what's going on here. And therefore, they sometimes come down too hard and then people fight back, or they let the colonists get away with stuff until then there's a change in administration and then everybody objects. Um, one reason or another, there are instances that don't add up to everyone being really mad at the English. What they add up to is from time to time the English make a mistake, and sometimes it leads to a local conflict. I'm going to give you one example of that, the most extreme example of the ways in which the English tried to have more political control, and how the colonists fought back on this particular occasion. This is the most extreme example. And so other examples are going to be smaller scale and don't involve as many dead people and so forth. But the Board of Trade that I previously mentioned, the people in England who were advising the king, the Board of Trade looked at the colonial map and suggested a policy change with regards to these colonies and the way they're organized that the king thought was a good idea in the middle 1680s, and Parliament and their leaders also agreed to. So there are some colonies that the English are pretty happy with. It seemed as if the Chesapeake colonies, the ones with all the plantation agriculture, it seemed as if they were easy to manage. It seemed as if from afar it was pretty easy to figure out what's going on there. The people in the Chesapeake are forcing their slaves to grow as many things as possible and ship a lot of that back to England and then from there to the rest of the world. And those colonies, it seemed as if they could manage. The English are pretty sure they know what's going on there, and they trust those people to keep doing that. But some of the other colonies they're worried about. The New England colonies, which had all been set up by Puritans, and although as you get deep into the 1600s, they're not quite as much Puritans anymore, and they're more economically independent. The Yankees. Still, there are a lot of them. They are rivalries against each other. They're hard to manage from far away, and they're all still a little weird. They're also still kind of Puritans, at least enough that the English aren't sure what to do with them. And then right next to New England is New York. New York had been controlled by the English for a couple of decades at this point, but still a lot of the people in New York are Dutch. Culturally and politically are not as connected to the English as is the case with some of these other colonies. And so the Board of Trade made a recommendation that the king, at this point it's James II, his brother had died, and so James II became king. Um, at this point, the king decides that he is going to take all of those colonies that he's not sure what to do with and just clump them together into one big colony. So, New York and all the New England colonies got put together into one mega colony called the Dominion of New England. An idea that nobody in the colonies ever would have thought of. This has to be an outside point of view. Somebody looks at the map and says, oh, they're all right next to each other. Let's just run them all as one thing. And so a governor for the whole Dominion of New England got sent over from England in the mid 1680s, a guy named Edmund Andros, is put in charge of New York and New England all as one big colony. But these are colonies that have been independent, in some cases for more than half a century, and they are in no way interested in being managed as one unit by some outsider who knows nothing about what's going on there. The Puritans, after all, the reason why they had so many different colonies in New England was they don't get along. They all have different ideas about what the ideal form of Puritan religion is. That's why Rhode Island got carved out of Massachusetts Bay Colony. What became Connecticut was a bunch of different Puritan groups who had their objections to and so forth. And so all these different Puritan colonies, they don't want to get along with each other. They don't really like each other that much, and certainly they don't like the idea of being put together, lumped in with all those Dutch people in the Hudson River and the colony of New York. That to them is crazy. Those people, as far as they're concerned, are all going to hell. There's certainly no way that they're good Christians, and the Puritans despise the idea of being put into this big mega colony by the English, who clearly don't know what they're talking about here. So there's a lot of resentment in New England and in New York to the idea of the Dominion of New England. And Governor Andros, the guy who's in charge of this big mega colony, has his hands full. Then, for reasons that I will get to in a little bit, then instability in England led to a change of administration there, at which point, in 1689, each of these little parts of the Dominion of New England realized that the governor who had been put in charge of the whole thing had been appointed by a guy who wasn't king anymore, and really his authority had essentially gone away. And so all the New England colonies then said, yeah, we're not going to be part of the Dominion of New England anymore. We're going to go back to being Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts and so forth. And in New York, they did the same thing. Except that in New York, it went a step further. Connecticut wants to just be back to being Connecticut. And Rhode Island wants to just be Rhode Island again. New York, they want to go back to being New York, but there's a moment as they're breaking away from the Dominion of New England where the Dutch settlers in New York are saying, well, if we're breaking away from this stupid thing that the English have imposed on us, maybe this is the moment where we break away and go back to the really old days and go back to being a Dutch colony, because most of the people in New York are still Dutch. It hasn't been ruled by the Dutch people for a generation, but the Dutch and their descendants are the dominant number of people in the New York colony. So, as the Dominion of New England is falling apart in 1689, and as each of these individual colonies reassert their authority, the way that works out in New York is that the leader of the New York militia, a guy named Jacob Leisler, who is German, he's of German descent, but is married to the daughter of one of the most powerful Dutch people in the colony, and therefore has connections with many of the powerful and important Dutch citizens of the colony. Leisler and his Dutch allies essentially took over the colony and made it a Dutch-run colony again. This became Leisler's rebellion. And Leisler became sort of self-appointed as the governor of this New York colony and tried to establish an independent path for them without outside interference and without really potentially even being part of the British Empire anymore. Leisler had some success. Not only was he greeted by the other Dutch citizens as a good guy, someone that they would follow, but even a lot of the English-speaking citizens were willing to follow him, because as a military leader, he quickly went after some Native American tribes that they'd been having problems with. And so in upstate New York, near Albany, Leisler and his men attacked a Native American tribe near there that there had been conflict with recently, and the people in upstate New York appreciate his efforts on their behalf because they're taking away Native American land, and they always get mad when the Native Americans fight back. So Leisler had some success managing this colony as an independent colony with him as the boss, as all the other Dutch settlers of the colony then try to reassert their authority to a place they used to run back in the day. But that didn't last all that long. Leisler took over in 1689. By 1691, things back in England had calmed down enough that the new king over there sent new governors back over here to manage the colonies here. The new king, King William, recognized that the Dominion idea, the idea of a mega colony, that was never going to work. He saw how it had broken up, and so he sent separate governors to Rhode Island and Massachusetts and so forth. But in 1691, he sent a new governor to New York. And that governor represents the return of English authority to New York because he's there to put down Leisler's rebellion. Leisler had failed as a leader. Economically, New York had begun to struggle after it initial looked like some success. Also in upstate New York, the Native Americans fought back, and people in upstate New York felt that Leisler hadn't helped them out that much after all. And ultimately, Leisler and a fairly small group of supporters, people who were convinced that they could hold on to New York as a Dutch colony, ultimately they were outnumbered, and the military authorities, led by this new governor sent by the king, regained control of the colony. And then they put Leisler and his allies on trial for treason, for basically trying to take this colony away from the English. Ultimately, Leisler and his men were found guilty of treason, and Leisler was executed. They hanged him. Then they drew and quartered him, which means that they literally like cut him into parts and tear him apart. And then they disemboweled him, and then they put his head on a pike and left that outside the fort for everyone else to realize this is what happens when you mess with the English. A few years later, friends of Leisler went to the Parliament, the political authorities over in England, and they were able to arrange that Leisler got a pardon, that he actually wasn't guilty of treason, which is a little bit too late and a strange thing to do. So, Leisler's rebellion, which is 1689 to 1691, is the last big ethnic attempt on the part of anyone here in the colonies to try to pull away from English control. And it's a very extreme example of some of the push-pull that's happening where the English don't really understand local politics. They do dumb things like the Dominion of New England, and then in the pushback, in this case, it led to violence, and it led to an actual true rebellion. Whereas in other cases, it was small scale, some individual leaders who got upset, and then maybe they get thrown into jail, or maybe they get what they want through negotiation, or maybe a new governor comes, or whatever. Those were smaller scale. Leisler's rebellion is the most extreme example of the ways in which the English, as a result of this idea of mercantilism, well, the English sometimes screwed up. The English overplayed their hand. They don't understand local politics very well. They think they're in charge. They think that these colonies exist for them, and therefore the English leaders, whether it's the king or the leaders of parliament or the folks on the board of trade, they have a tendency to push ideas on the colonies that the colonists, who are independent minded at least, that sometimes the colonists realize these are dumb and they're going to fight back against. In Leisler's case, the results are he gets chopped into pieces. So, good luck with that. Okay, so the colonists, to some extent, are going to be able to move forward after things like Leisler's rebellion in a more peaceful way, because back in England, the circumstances that led to Leisler's rebellion had, it appeared, finally made England itself a more stable place. They kept saying this is true. After this thing and after that thing, Henry VIII thought that he had solved everyone's problems, and Queen Elizabeth thought she had, and James I thought that he had, and after the English Civil War they thought they had, and after the Restoration they thought they had, but now they're convinced that they have solved all their problems because of something called the Glorious Revolution, which took place in England in 1688 and 1689. So, last time that I really need you to know about what's going on in English politics, I'll mention another English king or two, but from this point on, they're not going to be such a big a part of our story. But let's back it up a little and let's look at these Restoration kings. Charles II, who was the Restoration monarch, became the King of England, son of the old Charles, took over England again in 1660, and he ruled into the mid-1680s. Well, Charles II did a really weird thing. On his deathbed, at the last possible second, just before meeting his maker, he converted from Anglican, which is how he'd been raised and born, he's running that church. The last second, he converted to Catholic, which is weird. Seemed like an odd thing. It sort of sends a bad message that the leader of the country, at the last possible second, just before he meets God or whatever it is that happens after we die, he at the last second threw a flag and said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, I'm meeting God as a Catholic now." Kind of implies that he thinks the Catholics have the right deal, and that the church that he's been in charge of the entire time that he's been king doesn't. But that was weird. Whatever. You can handle it. It's sort of a strange moment, but then his brother took over as James II, and James II actually is a Catholic, and that's really weird. He had been an Anglican, but he had converted to Catholicism. His previous wife had died, and they had Anglican kids and so forth. But then he had married again after his previous wife died, and she's Catholic, and so James had converted to Catholicism. And that's really strange because they had fought wars and all kinds of things had gone on in England over religion, ultimately for more than 100 years now, almost 150 years now. They've been an Anglican country, a country where the religion is that Protestant faith, the Church of England, run by the king. And now you've got a king who, forget what his brother did on his deathbed, you got a king who is a Catholic, who is supposed to be in charge of the Anglican Church, which is the church of pretty much everybody in the country at this point. Well, that's weird. But James is old. I mean, he's a pretty old dude at this point. He's not going to last that much longer, presumably. And so, although it seemed pretty strange, the people in England, they thought they could deal with it. Because he's going to die. He won't be king forever. And then after he's dead, then one of his daughters will take over as a queen. And they're all Anglicans, and they all seem like they're not going any Catholic crazy directions. So it'll be fine. It's going to be weird. We're going to have a weird moment here. We're all gonna be one thing, and the king's gonna be something else. We're just sort of ignore that doddering old fool, and we're gonna let him, just sort of eventually fade away. But then the king's new wife, this recently married Catholic woman that he married, she gave birth to a son, and now the rules are changed. Now everything is going totally crazy because the rules are in England and in a lot of countries with their monarchs, and these rules aren't very fair, but these are the rules. The rules are that when a monarch dies, the eldest male heir takes the throne. So it didn't matter that the other children from the previous wife were daughters and they're older. Their daughters, they don't get to take the throne. They would have only get to take the throne if there were no guys. Well, now there's a guy. And what we're looking at in England is the probability of not only a certain number of years with James II as the king, and that's pretty weird. You got a Catholic in charge of a Protestant country. But now we're looking at after he's dead, the next monarch is going to be a Catholic. And maybe that king's monarch will be a Catholic. And that's just, no, not happening. The leaders of parliament, who, when you get down to it, had put this family on the throne. The leaders of parliament had pulled Charles II from obscurity, from he's hanging out over there in France doing whatever he is doing as a deposed son of a deposed monarch. Well, they brought him over, and then now that's why James II got to be king. This family got given the job by Parliament, and the leaders of Parliament, who are all Protestants, many of whom, used to be Puritans, these people are not going to accept the weird politics of religion that's going on at the top of the throne there with England. So, James II, this weird Catholic king, has very little idea about what's going on, but the leaders of parliament are looking to get rid of him. As I said, he has daughters. His daughters are Anglicans. One of his daughters, a woman named Mary, had married an important Dutch political leader, a guy named William, and they're living over in the Netherlands. The leaders of parliament got in touch with them and said, listen, if we get rid of your dad, would you guys like to take over? And, what are they doing? Sure, why not? Absolutely. Leaders of parliament made sure you guys are Anglicans, right? You're Protestants. We don't have to worry about you being Catholic. And William and Mary are like, yeah, we're good. We're good. The whole Protestant thing is the way we go. And the leaders of parliament said, and listen, let's be clear. We're going to be giving you this job. Parliament, the people who make the laws in the country, we're going to give you this job. Not your dad, not God. not some other outside force, us, which means that if we give you this job, you have to accept that really we're in charge of the country. And you're just going to be sort of the monarchs and you get to be rich and, your face will be on money and stuff like that. And William and Mary, again, what else are they doing? So they agreed. Once the deal was worked out, then at that point, then the final result of an uprising against James II. James II realized he's totally outnumbered. There's someone waiting in the wings to take over, and therefore he fled the country the way Charles I had, or Charles II had when Charles I got his head cut off. So James II left. Parliament installed William and Mary as the new monarchs, king and queen, ruling together. They take over, they get put on the throne in 1689. And this moment is referred to by historians of England, by people in England, as the Glorious Revolution. The conflict between James and Parliament started in 1688 and it finished in 1689 with the enthronement of William and Mary in 1689, and that period there, the Glorious Revolution. Why glorious? Well, it was glorious because they didn't really have to kill anybody. Unlike previously with the English Civil War, which was a devastating thing where both sides had lined up against each other and they fought a war that lasted about a decade and destroyed the countryside, and it was a big mess. This, basically, they sort of lined up against the king, and the king realized he's outnumbered, and without really fighting that much about it, he just sort of gave up and left. Much easier, much less devastating, glorious in that way. Glorious because they're also happy with the religion part of it, but it's also glorious in after hindsight because it's finally true that England has finished up all the political conflicts between kings and parliament and kings that have been going on for centuries. So it seems to them like they finally turn that page and they can move forward to making England a powerful country, to making England a stable country, to making England economically a successful country. From that moment on, the Glorious Revolution seems like it's really the beginning of something new, of England being something strong in a way that it had just always never been able to be before because they kept fighting amongst themselves. We're going to hear next class about some of the important political ramifications of the Glorious Revolution because there are going to be some important political changes that happen as a result of it, but we'll get to them next class. Now, the Glorious Revolution also made Leisler's rebellion possible because while England is focusing on their own problems, no one's paying that much attention for a couple of years to what's going on here in the colonies, which gave Leisler his moment, but it also ended his moment when eventually William and Mary sent a new governor and Leisler got deposed again and then, of course, executed multiple different ways. The English aren't messing around. So, from that point on, after the somewhat chaotic times that are as a result of what's going on in England, and after the colonists had figured out a way to deal with and live with to the best they could with the ideas of mercantilism, which their solution is to cheat, after that, things very much settled in and stabilized. The English economy continued to thrive, and in other ways, they're going to be doing well in Europe and in other parts of the world as their colonial empire is going to grow. And so they're pretty happy. And the colonists over here are pretty happy and enter into a period of tremendous growth. The population from 1690 to 1720, so roughly the Glorious Revolution to a generation later, doubled. And then if you jump ahead another couple of generations to 1760, it goes up to about 1.2 million. So the colonial set of colonies, this little network of colonies along the eastern seaboard of the Atlantic coast, began to grow significantly. Partly that's because they're having lots of kids, but partly it's also because it seemed economically that this was a viable and stable place, and therefore people start coming here from England. And these colonies began to grow. They grow in size, they expand, they also grew economically. This is a period where the English pretty much leave them alone. They think that mercantilism is working. They see the results of mercantilism, at least as they understand it, as their own success and the colonists' success. There's a complicated network of trade that the colonists are part of. Some of it they're doing legally, some of it they're doing illegally. When you're back in social studies, you may have been taught about triangle trade. In fact, the trade that the colonists are involved in is a much more complicated lattice, a network of trade that they are playing a big part in that interconnects all kinds of places on either side of the Atlantic. The slave trade out of Africa, unfortunately, the raw materials coming out of the Caribbean, especially sugar and things related to that, processed goods that are coming from England and other parts of Europe, and then all the other raw materials that the colonists here are shipping all over the world, whether that be tobacco, rice, and indigo, whether it be fur that they're getting from the Native American trade up in New England and farther into the coast, um, whether it be fish or timber. There's an incredibly complex amount of goods that are being shipped back and forth, many of them going through these colonial ports. And a triangle is only the beginning of explaining what's going on in this trade, but it is very successful on both sides. There's also the beginning of a little bit of industry as some of the colonists begin to figure out ways that they can make some things themselves. Although for the most part, the English are not encouraging that. They'd rather make stuff themselves and then sell that back here to the colonists. The goal really is the colonists provide the raw materials, send that to England. England produces finished goods, sell that back to the colonists or to the rest of the world. Okay, nevertheless, with this expansion, it's predicated on economic success and economic growth, and that's happening pretty consistently throughout the colonies. This is a period of economic growth, economic success, and very few economic hiccups, to the point where you begin to see, as these economies begin to mature, you begin to see separation starts to take place. In the early days of the colonies, there wasn't really any important class-based separation. Yes, in New England, we heard about how the saints had been chosen largely from the economic elites, but really the difference between a wealthy Puritan, a middle-class Puritan, and a poor Puritan is pretty negligible. And in the early days of the Chesapeake colonies, there clearly were some people who were doing better than others. But the reality is that in the early days, they're all desperately that close to another starving time, and they're all sort of in it together. And economic distinctions really aren't that important in the early days when you're starting out a colony from scratch. But over time, as an economic system develops, as society develops, it seems like it's a natural phenomenon where some people have and some people do not have. And ultimately, you begin to have class stratification. People like to talk about the United States as not having any classes or as maybe completely a middle class society. Of course, that's not true. As anyone who is poor recognizes, rich people like to pretend that there's no classes, and sometimes middle class people like to pretend that they're the only thing. But there are plenty of poor people in this country today, which is an indication that there are social classes and economic classes. And that was true back in the colonial days as they began to diversify and as their economic system began to mature. Some people are poor, some people are rich, and some people are in the middle. The people who are especially poor are mostly in a couple of categories. Slaves, of course, are not only poor, they are defined as property of others and not allowed to own property in their own mind, in their own right, and have no independence, and all their labor and everything that they produce is going for other people. So I'm not even sure that a slave counts as someone poor, because even if you're poor, you have a chance to rise up. The slaves are defined by all the laws and the society as someone who can never rise up, who can never achieve any kind of greater success. But still, there's a large and growing number of slaves, especially south of the Chesapeake and on south. Native Americans are also a class of people who are economically deprived. Their land is being taken away from them. Their ability to be independent economically is becoming even more straitened as the English are taking away their land, as the English colonies are expanding. Some Native American tribes did their best to stay where they were and trade or hold on to some land for themselves. Others wound up being pushed aside and fought that. Ultimately, Every time the Native Americans fight, they may have some successes, but eventually the white people with the guns succeed and push them farther away, or defeat them at least for a while. Women are a category we're going to hear about later, but women, although you may be part of an economically elite class, can't own property for themselves, and so they're, for the most part, unless they're unmarried and wealthy, they're not really going to be in the same kind of social class that their husbands are in, but they're in the class. So really what we're talking about are the white dudes. And within the white males, you begin to see some economic distinctions. Particularly we're talking about is the beginning of wealth. The beginning of some folks who are able to pull themselves away and to then have wealth and status above that of most of their neighbors. In a way that just wasn't the case. If you talk about in the early days of the colonies, you look at Philadelphia in the early days of Philadelphia, everybody pretty much is the same at first. Well, different kinds of wealth is created in different parts of the colonies. The Chesapeake and the farther southern colonies, you begin to see families who amass tremendous amounts of wealth through land, slave ownership, and then plantation agriculture. Often these are families that can trace their roots back to the very early days, to the early founding of the colonies. A lot of those people in the early days didn't make it, but those who did were able to get their hands on a lot of land and then use that land as ultimately as plantation agriculture. They'll be the people who hire the indentured servants, purchase the slaves, force those people to work for them, and develop their own economic success over time. There are some very, very wealthy families in Maryland and Virginia and the Carolinas who, because they got in early and because they had success with plantation agriculture, really become the dominant figures in those colonies for generations. In Virginia, there's a family that started out early in Virginia in the early Jamestown days that not only was one of the richest families in Virginia for centuries, but also one of the politically dominant families in Virginia. These are the Byrd family, B-Y-R-D, and they were still electing governors and senators in Virginia and West Virginia into my lifetime, and yet they date back to the 1600s. So, plantation owners, the wealthiest farmers, the wealthiest landowners, the wealthiest exploiters of the labor, mostly of slaves, they began to separate themselves out economically from everybody else, either from the slaves who they owned, whose labor they're exploiting, and who are using violence to get that labor, or the poor farmers who are supporting the rich plantation owners economically or are trying to sort of make it on their own independently with a much smaller amount of land and mostly just growing food for themselves. If you go up to the middle Atlantic, to the middle colonies, and then to New England, wealth there is not really so much about land and certainly not about slavery. There's very little of the plantation slavery and plantation growing in the middle or New England colonies, very little of it at all. Instead, wealth there tends to be based on status, education, and trade. Boston as the first really big, important port city in New England, and then eventually the other New England port cities like New Haven, Connecticut, like Providence, Rhode Island, and then especially New York and Pennsylvania, as those port cities were founded or became taken over by the English. Those major port cities where so much trade is coming in and out, heading toward England, those people there, some of them did very well and became very wealthy and therefore began to step up economically, socially, and culturally from their neighbors. Um, there are shippers, there are bankers, there are insurance brokers, there are people who own ships or who rent ships who are involved in this international cross-Atlantic trade who begin to make fortunes. There are some Boston merchants who begin to build large homes and have tremendous wealth that is displayed there. There are New Yorkers and Philadelphians who likewise are doing very well in the trade that's coming through their ports. So many raw materials that are going to come through those ports as sort of a bottleneck from which they're going to go out to the rest of the world. As the key middlemen in that trade, there are people who are going to make fortunes, again, as lawyers or shippers or merchants, who are then going to take those fortunes, that economic status, and they're going to separate themselves from their neighbors through wealth, through their standard of living, the way they dress, the way they're educated, and so forth. And you begin to have, as a result of the economic changes after, especially the late 1600s, you begin to have some people who separate away and who are different from and economically kind of above everybody else. In all those regions, the wealthiest ones are the best educated because they can afford to send their kids to school at a time when there's no public education. The wealthiest ones are the politicians because they have the leisure time and the education to get into politics and recognize the usefulness for their own families getting laws or at least getting policies that will support them. The wealthiest ones often are the religious leaders. In a lot of these colonies, the wealthy families are the ones that are going to hold on to the idea of trying to get their sons as important religious figures or so forth. And so as a result, you have a kind of a leadership class that's being created out of economics. Now, in other parts of the world, in other societies, when you start to have this kind of diversification, when you start to have people pulling away, you start to have people who have more money, more status, and more power than anyone else, that leads to conflict. A lot of the story of the last few hundred years has been about that kind of conflict, about the ways in which some people get more power and status and then others fight back against that. And yet, this is not a place where there are significant class resentments, at least not as they play out in the day to day or in the politics or in the culture for a lot of reasons. So, unlike in European history, where there will be class based conflicts, where poor people will resent the rich people and will attack them from time to time or try to overthrow examples of their power. Unlike that, there's very little of that happens here in the colonies, which isn't to say that no one wouldn't like to be rich, but the reality is that most people here are doing okay. Although, yes, there are people who are rich, although wealth is happening, compared to the situation in Europe, especially compared to the situation in England, where most of these people had come from or their ancestors had come from, here in America, here in these colonies, most people are doing better than most people would have been doing back in England. By the standards of England, most people here in the colonies are what would be considered middle class, which is to say they have a roof over their heads. They have a livelihood. They have a living that they can make. They have jobs that they can be paid fairly well for. They can be farmers, which is to say they can get land and grow food, and that land is something they control, and they will be able to control their own livelihoods and so forth, depending on how the weather goes and how the growing goes and so forth. That's not something that anybody could ever have imagined if you stayed in England. All the land is already owned there by the rich people. So about 80% of all Americans in the early 1700s are farmers, which doesn't mean that they're rich, but it does mean that compared to the average person in England or other parts of Europe, they're doing much better because they own their own land. They control their own lives. They can make their own decisions. They have some comfort. They have, some things that people in England just can't even imagine. And although the rich people are getting richer, there isn't as much resentment against them because it is not hard to become rich or for rich people to not be rich anymore. The lines that divide the wealthiest from the not as wealthiest are more permeable than they are in other cultures, and certainly than they are in our own time, when the best way, my suggestion to you, to get rich is to be born rich, or if you can't pull that off, to marry somebody rich. Otherwise, if you're born poor, you'll probably stay poor. If you're born rich, you'll probably stay rich. If you're born in the middle, you'll probably stay in the middle. Depends on your circumstances, but that's the numbers. But rich people lose their fortunes all the time. And so there is much less resentment against those rich people because sometimes those rich bankers, their banking collapses, or the shippers, things don't work out for them, or even the rich plantation owners down in the South. Their fortunes sometimes can collapse in just a short period of time. All you need is a couple of bad years of the harvest, and the rich plantation owners, who are farmers like everybody else, who rely on the crop coming in once a year and the profits of that once a year, have a couple of bad years of that, and you wind up having the bank repossess your land. And they just go back to being just regular, everyday Virginian or South Carolinian or whatever. The rich bankers, the rich merchants up in New England, sometimes their fortunes disappear overnight. All you need is a couple of bad investments. All you need is a ship that sinks on its way over to England, and boom, you may be completely out of money. And so those people are not going to be able to assume that they're always going to be rich. People who are middle class might be able to move up, and people who are rich are going to move down sometimes, which means there'll be less resentment. The people of all different classes, especially in the big cities, they all know each other and interact with each other in ways that also make it less likely for there to be resentment. So today, wealthy people separate themselves out from poor people or from everyday middle class people. They're behind gates. They have guards. They have ways in which they can make sure that if they don't want to, they don't have to rub elbows with people like you and me. Uh, but that's not possible in colonial society. The richest banker in all of the colonies on the eve of the American Revolution was a guy who lived in Philadelphia. And yet, census records show that on the same block that he lived, there also were day laborers who get up in the morning and go trying to find a job to pay for the rent or to pay for the food that their family needs. These guys are neighbors. They know each other. They may go to the same church. They may have some of the same friends. They certainly can communicate with each other. They will have to at least, wave to each other in the morning or in the evening or when they're out walking the dog. There is less division socially because these cities and these communities are small and these people all really kind of know each other. Um, Also, there aren't as many institutions in the colonies designed to separate the rich people out from the poor people. There are things in England that already existed and had existed for hundreds of years that at the time and continue to now help separate rich people from poor people. So wealthiest families will have a status of being a sir this or this kind of knighthood or whatever, and that with that knighthood not only comes power and land, it also gives you a seat in the House of Lords. Part of Parliament is reserved just for rich people. There's nothing as formal as that here in the colonies. There's no political institution just for the rich people. And so they're not separating out like that. A lot of the institutions that we think of as education institutions were created ultimately not just for that, but also for class reasons. The wealthiest ancient universities in places like England, Cambridge and Oxford, places like that, a lot of their social purpose was to give wealthy people a place to all get together and to know each other, to create a network that would then reaffirm their class status in the long run. Rich people who all hang out together, they all speak the same language, they all tell the same jokes, they hold their pinkies the same way when they drink their tea, they all prepped together or went to college together, they got drunk together, they marry each other's cousins or whatever. Those institutions are designed to reaffirm who the ruling class is. That doesn't exist here. Our ideas, even today, of education are at least a little bit more egalitarian. The idea here is that education is about giving you the skills, but also the credentials necessary to achieve a middle class way of life. But even, and that's a much more recent idea, but there were very few of these sorts of institutions that are designed to separate some people from everyone else, including educational institutions. On the eve of the American Revolution, there were just a handful of colleges all throughout the colonies, and they were so small they had a negligible effect on the society or the culture, and a lot of them were even for this purpose. So the first college established in the colonies is Harvard College, 1636, right around the same time as the Anne Hutchinson controversy, partly designed as a way to train their ministers better. So if another Anne Hutchinson showed up, they could argue against such a person better. Harvard was and continued for more than a century to be a place that Puritans trained ministers, a tiny little school where the education is largely focused on religion, and ultimately, although by the 1800s is where rich people send their kids, was not at that at all the way up through the American Revolution. There's only a handful of other colleges that existed in the colonial period. The second one is William and Mary, established in 1689, kind of a place for rich plantation owners to send their kids, but is the exception that proves the rule, because then the third one is Yale, established in Connecticut, New Haven, Connecticut in 1701, also a place for Puritans to send kids to be ministers, because one Puritan college is not good enough when the Puritans all hate each other and disagree with each other. And by the time of the Revolution, there's just a handful more: Rutgers in New Jersey, Princeton in New Jersey, King's College in New York, which becomes Columbia, and just one or two others. Tiny, negligible effect culturally. Not much of a reason to really lead to the same kind of resentment or the same kind of class agglomeration that, say, a big Oxford or a big Cambridge has that same effect and had for hundreds of years. So, if you look at these colonies, there's just not that much reason yet for there to be the same kind of class conflict, the same kind of, although there's stratification, the same kind of distinction and disagreement, and even a political system that's based along class lines. That just doesn't really happen yet. Instead, the other thing is that there really aren't that many poor people. Again, there are slaves who are a category unto themselves, whose lives are miserable, horrible, and they have very little hope of ever getting out of that, and it's going to be one of the shames of the entire American story. There are Native Americans whose status is very difficult as well. And of course, the status of women is also difficult, and one we're going to have to address if we're going to grow up as a society. But among the white guys, who are the ones who are running the country, who are running these colonies, who are telling the stories, among them, there just aren't that many poor people. If you look at England and most of the rest of Europe, a lot of people are poor. In some places, almost everybody is poor. You go to the big cities, you go to London in the early 1700s, you go to Manchester, Birmingham, which are growing cities, you go to some of the bigger cities in Scotland or Ireland, all throughout the British Isles. There's a tremendous amount of poverty. Very few people have any property. Very few people have any hope. Whereas here, most people have jobs, they have land, they have prospects, they have opportunity. If you have any kind of a skill, you come here to the colonies and you can be paid 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 times as well as you've been paid for that skill back in England, because there's much less competition here and much more need. In a place that's growing, expanding all the time, they're looking for people who are carpenters. They're looking for people who have any kind of physical skill, any kind of physical training. You can name your price practically if you have any kind of a skill, or you can learn that skill and quickly move into a fairly well-paid kind of a job. Not the case back in England. Even if you have a skill, if you've come up through some sort of a trade, because there's so many other people with the same skill, your skill is devalued. You're not paid that well. Most working class people in England are quite poor. Whereas people who we think of as working class here in the colonies, because there is such demand for their labor, because there is demand for their skills, they are paid reasonably well for the most part. If they have any kind of trade at all, if they have any kind of education at all, if they have any kind of prospects at all. And worst case scenario, even if you don't have those skills, then you have the opportunity to get land, which is not available anywhere in England because all the rich people have all the land. Well, the Native Americans have all the land, but the Americans are not thinking about them. They're thinking, all I need to do, if it doesn't work out here, I can just move on and head farther west, farther upstate, farther inland, and start over. There's land there. I can be a farmer. I can live, I can be a landowner, I can be independent, um, and therefore, essentially, by what we would call the standards of the day, the middle class is an option for almost everybody. To be poor, to be truly desperately poor, to not be able to feed your family, to not necessarily be able to have a roof over one's head, is so unusual and so rare. One scholar, a guy in Parliament, referred to the English colonies here in the mid 1700s as the best poor man's country in the world, by which he meant because there just aren't that many poor people. Because to be poor and to be here in the colonies meant to have an almost limitless series of opportunities to achieve, to get out of poverty, to leave to your children or your grandchildren some kind of higher status or land or something, uh, unlike what was the case in England or the other parts of Europe. An example of that is the fact that in England, most towns of any size and all the big cities had a poorhouse, which is a place run by the local government where people who had no money and no home would live in that poorhouse. The poorhouse is run by the local government, and then the people living in it perform basic tasks and maybe build things or grow things that are then sold to the community as a way to pay for the poorhouse and a way to pay for them to have a roof over their head. There are no poorhouses here in the colonies. Not until 1732 is there a poorhouse anywhere organized in any of these colonies. Finally, Philadelphia established one in 1732 because they finally had a big enough population that they found a need for it, as opposed to having little small local neighborhood things helping out some charities for the occasional poor person who might need some help. 1732, Philadelphia put together an actual poorhouse that they had to raise money to build, the first city in all of the colonies to do that. And by the American Revolution, they never had more than 100 people in the poorhouse at any given time. Which means, do the math, extrapolate a little bit. I mean, if there's no more than about 100 people in Philadelphia at any given time who are so poor they don't have a roof over their head, what does that mean for the whole colonies? 1,000? A few thousand? Extraordinarily low levels of poverty. And so this is indeed, in many ways, the best poor man's country in the world. A place where it seems like people should be getting along and should be happy, and where there should be prosperity and hope. Um, and then there's another event that's we're talking about in this long stretch of colonial history that I'm doing here. And so not only are they going to have hope economically and hope from the lack of class stratification, but they're also getting hope, it appears, from religion. Religious sentiment was never all that important a part of the founding of, say, Virginia or the Carolinas. Not all that important a part of, say, New York or New Jersey, but it had been a big part of the story in many of the other colonies in their early days. But religious sentiment had begun to fade over time. I mentioned the Puritans aren't really Puritans by the early 1700s. They pray a lot, but they're not as strong in their faith. They're not as fervent. And many of the other English colonists are really not religious in the same kind of strong sense that you might have talked about centuries earlier. They're focused on economics, they're focused on their day to day lives, and religion is something that happens, but it's not as important to them. But um, a, a wave of religion and the growth and expansion of religion started in the 1730s and peaked in the 1740s in England, and then came on over here to the colonies called the Great Awakening. There are a bunch of evangelists, which is a traveling minister who traveled throughout England and then in some cases came over here to the colonies to try to spread the idea of Christianity, to try to spread the idea of church going and of following the Bible. Um, as a result of the Great Awakening, some big Protestant denominations like the Methodists and the Baptists took off in a big way in England, and likewise over here in the colonies. There's a huge explosion of religious fervor. The key guy, one of the most famous guys in this on both sides of the Atlantic, was an English minister named George Whitefield, who was one of the early initiators of this religious revival in England, coming right out of college, traveled around the English countryside preaching and trying to encourage anybody who listened to him to be more a part of the faith. His preaching, his ministry was so electric that hundreds or thousands of people would come hear him speak. He came over here to the colonies, late 1630s, 1730s, and early 1740s, and likewise had an electric effect everywhere he traveled. Up in New England, where they used to be Puritans, he helped bring about a major religious revival there, and also in other parts of the colonies where there is a huge uprising, a huge expansion in religious sentiment. They're tapping into some kind of latent need for religious sentiment that had been sort of dormant for a while. The Great Awakening leads to a major expansion in religious ideals and in religious sentiment here in the colonies. It kind of faded away. By the time we get to the American Revolution, church going levels had returned to about what they had been in the early 1700s, but is actually the beginning of a series of waves of religious revivals here in the New World. Uh, in fact, this one in the 1730s and 1740s, we look back on it now and we call it the First Great Awakening because periodically throughout American history, there will be other religious revivals. There's another one coming. I'll do another one this semester after the midterm, which will be even more important. But the First Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s was a big explosion of religious sentiment that, for a while at least, made the colonists one of the most Christian places in the world. Again, sort of faded away later. So you put all these things together. You have economic growth. You've got outside interference that they're largely ignoring. You've got limited class stratification. You've got some conflict, but mostly at the local level. You've got ongoing conflicts with Native Americans whose land they're stealing. You've got a rise of religious sentiment, at least for a while. You put all these things together, and it seems like the colonists are happy and content. It seems like they have reason to be optimistic. They're growing, they're expanding. Economically, they're growing. Population, they're growing. They're part of the British Empire, which is doing very well. You put all that together, it seemed very much like by the mid 1700s, this mature system of the English colonies was successful, was a place where they should be pretty happy, and in some ways would seem like the last place in the world that there would ever be a revolution. And yet, the story of our lecture next week is going to be how this seemingly happy and successful group of colonies became a hotbed, ultimately, of a series of crises that are going to lead to, indeed, that very revolution, which will make it possible for us to be an independent country. That's next class. For now, we're done. Not as long as the last one. Thank you for your time. Please send me some notes about this lecture. Do you have any questions about it? Any particular thing that you think that was most important? It's good for me to hear back from you so I have some idea of what you're learning. And otherwise, thanks. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you next Tuesday.